This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Neer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, promoting knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post newspaper and the co-author of a recently published book entitled The Weapons Wizards: How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower. It was recently published in English by St. Martin's Press. Yaakov Katz, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad.
So Israel is often touted as the startup nation. How much of that reputation is owed to the technological advances in the military field that you recount in your book?
I think a lot of it originates in the military. I think that you'll find that Israel's military is unique in the sense that it creates this structure and this ecosystem that promotes, fosters, nurtures innovation and creativity. And a lot of what you see in the high-tech, in the civilian high-tech sector, actually will find its origins in the Israeli military. That's where they get that original kind of bud of innovation, the spark of innovation is within the military.
Is that because the military is so pervasive in our life, in our public life here in Israel?
Well, I think it's a number of elements. One is the fact that you have a lot of Israelis who serve in the military, right? It used to be more. The number is dropping a bit, but it's still a large percentage of Israeli men and women who go to serve in the IDF. And the second part of it is that you have a military system unlike its Western counterparts, right? The Israeli military is unique that what rank you wear on your shoulder doesn't really mean anything to anyone else in the IDF. So I might have a high-ranking officer who's my commander, but I'll speak openly in front of him. I'll question his or her authority. I'll argue with them openly, even in the presence of foreign dignitaries. It won't make a difference because we believe, but the military has been built around this type of culture that basically freedom of ideas, free flow and exchange of information, an argumentative setting, having chutzpah is essential for being innovative, for being creative, when we can talk openly with one another.
And how does that translate into technological cutting edge? I mean, this is really the argument in your book. Take us through it.
Well, I could give you specific examples, and I'll do that in a second, but the theme of it is the fact that when I can speak with you openly, you hear me, I hear you, that is the key formula for innovation. Good people who come together, who talk, who can argue, who can debate something, that's where you can innovate. And you see this countless times throughout the book. There was the Chaim Eshed, who was a colonel in the Israeli military intelligence back in the 1970s, who came up with the idea for Israel to build a satellite. And everyone shot him down. All his commanders thought it was a bad idea. His colleagues thought it was a bad idea. But he persisted. He kept on going. He found a way to make his way to the defense minister, to the prime minister, to the chief of staff, until finally he convinced them that this was something that was possible, feasible, and Israel could do it, and that it would succeed. And it did. You see this when it came to Iron Dome, which is a great example of where the IDF chief of staff was opposed to it. The deputy chief of staff was opposed to it. Other officers in the IDF were opposed to it. But one guy had this idea, and he decided that he was going to do it, and he pushed it through. Mm-hmm. So this is a theme that you often find of where people say no, but the people who come up with the idea reject that authority and persist and persevere.
But you can say the same thing about military tactic. For example, Sharon's crossing the tunnel against the advice of everybody in 1973. What is really the link to technology? How does it translate into technological advance?
Well, I think you're right. That's part of the Israeli culture, what you just touched upon. So you'll find that, whether it's Sharon crossing the Suez or whether it's Danny Gold pushing through the Iron Dome, or it's, the taxi driver who's yelling at you while you're in his cab, right? So you'll find that in all different places of Israeli society. But where it comes into technology is two places. One is pushing through an idea and a concept, but also is being able to see the idea and the concept, being able to piece things together. And one of the great examples of that was in drones, when Israel basically gave birth to the first drone in the late 1960s. There was one officer who came up with this crazy idea, which almost seems so simple. Take a toy airplane, attach a camera to it, and fly it over the Suez Canal. And that's literally what Israel did. They bought toy airplanes in New York City, brought them back to Israel, took a camera, attached it to it, put it on a timer. Then there wasn't a button that you could press by remote control to take photos. And then they flew that over the Suez. The first flight was in July of 1969. And that was the first flight of a drone. And you look today, Israel exports about $1 billion annually of drone technology. Up a few years ago, we had a 60% market share on drone exports in the world. That's a huge success, right? So where did all that come from? From a guy who came up with an idea to fly a toy airplane over the Suez Canal. That's incredible innovation.
But also, looking at it, as they say, necessity is the mother of all invention. There isn't really a necessity here. There isn't really a need for this great advanced technology, right?
On the contrary.
I'm saying that Israel did pretty well with its low-tech military technology, with tanks and rifles in its wars.
On the contrary, I beg to differ. When your back is up against the wall, Israel had no resources. You go back to the 1960s. When did the technological revolution take place? I like to look at Charles de Gaulle, the French president, as the father of Israel's high-tech revolution, because what he did in 1967 by imposing an arms embargo on Israel because of the Six-Day War essentially forced Israel to understand it could not rely on anyone but itself, to force Israel to understand that it had to develop its own independent manufacturing, research and development, production capabilities. And that's where you suddenly saw Israel take off and start to build its own systems, its own capabilities, whether it was electronic warfare, radars, drones, tanks, and even airplanes. It started to build on its own. And that also started to move into academia when the Technion set up its, first computer engineering and computer science departments, when the government started to put chief scientists in different ministries throughout the Israeli government. That all happened in the mid to late 60s. Now, what Israel also recognized is that at the end of the day, this was something that Ben Gurion recognized early on after Israel was first established in 1948. We will never have as many troops as the Syrians, we'll never have as many tanks as the Egyptians. But what we need is what's called a qualitative military edge. So because your back is up against the wall, you mentioned necessity, the mother of all invention. Chaim Eshed, that guy I mentioned to you, came up with the idea for the satellite, had a great line. I give him credit for it. The shadow of the guillotine sharpens the mind. When you are on the brink of annihilation, as Israel was for many times throughout its history in the 60s and the 70s, definitely in the 40s and 50s, you have to think out of the box. You have to be creative. No, Israel had no resources. We were a country with no oil, then no gas, right? Nothing but our brains, nothing but the Jewish brain. And that's what enabled this success. So your back is up against the wall. You have to think out of the box, toy airplane. Your back is up against the wall. Egypt's withdrawing, we're withdrawing from the Sinai to give it back to Egypt to make peace. How are we going to see what's happening in the Sinai? Satellite. Who had satellites back in the late 70s? Only superpowers. China, Soviets, the Americans, the French. Little Israel is going to make a satellite. So the combination of the necessity with the innovation creates the technological find.
But that state of mind still persists, even though, it's pretty undeniable that Israel is a military superpower in the Middle East, isn't it?
I completely agree. I think that Israel today is in the heyday of its existence.
So do you think we are still captive of that state of mind, of being in the shadow of the guillotine?
I think we still are. I think that's a combination of two parts. One is there are still serious threats against us, right? Hezbollah is believed to have about 130,000 rockets and missiles that can cover all of Israel today, unlike in 2006. Can accurately and precisely target buildings, the Israeli towers or my office here in Jerusalem, right? I hope they wouldn't want to, but that's possible. But those are serious threats. They're not existential threats, right? Hezbollah with all its rockets and missiles can't destroy the state of Israel like we feared Nasser would have done back in the 1960s. So we have to deal with those threats, and I don't want to minimize them, but they are threats and we can deal with them. The problem is, not the problem. What I meant is that you have a connection between real threats and also, I like to call it Jewish paranoia, right? We still, for some reason, live in this fear that, tomorrow we're about to be destroyed, when we're not. In my opinion, is that we are the most powerful we've ever been. And this, moves into a whole different topic of what do you do now with this power that you have? How do you translate that into opportunities, whether it's diplomatic opportunities, economic opportunities? That's a separate discussion, but
we'll get to in a second.
We could get to that, but I think it's a combination of real threats, not existential, but real threats with the Jewish paranoia that we all, I think Jews have had for millennia.
Mm-hmm. So really, what do you think that it does to the Israeli state of mind if war or waging a war has become so effortless in a way. I mean, there's some drone out there doing the job for us. There's Iron Dome protecting us from missiles north and south. What does it really do? How does it affect our willingness, our propensity to take risks and to make gestures for peace?
You know, there's two levels to that question. One is, how does it translate into war, and how do we approach war today? And I think it's a good question. Are we a bit standoffish about war? Do we feel like it's some distant thing that doesn't really touch us anymore? And you kind of saw that during the Gaza war of 2014, where Iron Dome worked amazingly, right? And even though rockets were fired at Tel Aviv, it protected Tel Aviv, and people went on with their lives. So on the one hand, you could say that's a great thing, right? We're not going to let rockets and war disrupt our lives. On the other hand, you could say, well, it kind of makes it seem as if this war is not connected to us, and therefore we don't care. And then we just kind of turn a blind eye to what's happening around us, when really there's a major problem that needs to be dealt with, i.e. the Palestinian conflict, right? So that's something that needs to be...
But maybe it's not a major problem anymore, thanks to all that. Our ability, thanks to our technology, to manage that conflict.
But it's not going away. In other words, yes, what we've done is we've taken rockets and we've turned them from a strategic threat to a tactical threat, right? No longer does it disrupt lives like it used to. Now we can intercept them. That's great. You know, tunnels, big problem. We saw that in the war 3 years ago. But okay, now we have some technology. We're more aware. We can detect maybe a little better. Okay, so now we can potentially deal with that more effectively. It's still a threat, though. But I mean, the point is, they're not going away. Gaza is still there. That Hamas is still in control. There are terrorists who still want to kill Israel. So how do we mitigate that? How do we deal with that? And I don't think we found yet the right solution. Each time they'll come up with something, we'll come up with something. It's like kind of the ping pong back and forth, which is good, and that saves lives, and it's important, but it's not getting to the core, the source of the problem. I still feel that Israelis are connected to war. With all that said, it's not just a drone that's flying somewhere. It's not just a fighter jet that's bombing something. You saw in the Gaza war that, you know, Israel did try to not have to go into Gaza, and eventually it went into Gaza, and that war went on for way too long, and I have a lot of criticism of it. But the point is that at the end of the day, troops went in, lives were lost, heavy prices were paid on both sides, right? But you saw that it doesn't prevent those lives from being lost ultimately, right? A drone is good. It can do something. Iron Dome is great. It can save lives. But at the end of the day, you still need eventually to put boots on the ground.
Exactly.
That's what happened.
So really, I think that was going to be my next question, how it affects the know-how and the norms within the army. Because if you go back to one example, the Second Lebanon War, I mean, Israel's lackluster performance in it was attributed in great part to the so-called plasma screens behind which the commanders sat instead of actually going out to the field. How does the IDF perceive this balance between boots on the ground and technology? Are they still grappling with it?
I think they're still grappling with it. I think they're still trying to find the right balance, and it's a delicate balance. On the one hand, Israel, pretty quickly after the Second Lebanon War, when the first Gaza operation, the large-scale one, Katz led in 2008-9, commanders were leading their troops behind enemy lines. That already changed, and that was a turning point. The Second Lebanon War, definitely for that type of culture that had been cultivated within the IDF.
Do you think that this criticism was justified? Did they really rely too heavily on technology in that war?
It was a reliance somewhat on technology, somewhat on the Air Force, and somewhat on a misunderstanding what is the role of a commander. I was in forward positions during that war along the northern border, and I saw the brigade commanders sitting behind
as a military correspondent.
As a military correspondent back then. That was my position. So, you know, I saw them. I remember one specific day, I don't want to name names, but there was one brigade that was deep inside Lebanon and was sustaining casualties, and the brigade commander was 5 feet away from me, you know, in a bomb shelter looking at plasma screens. So there was something wrong with that culture, but that's been fixed, I think, in the IDF, and there's kind of an awareness and an understanding where the commander needs to be. The question is, how do you use technology effectively? And I think that that's the balance. You try to use the technology to the point that you can end conflict or prevent conflict without having to put people's lives on the line. And I think that that's what, you know, we saw in Gaza recently. I think that's what you're seeing now kind of happening along Israel's northern border with Syria, where it's a tenuous situation and there's some clashes that go back and forth. But obviously Israel doesn't want to go into Syria. Might eventually that happen if something big, some colossal attack takes place? It's possible. But I think always Israel's policy has been the same. since its inception as a state is to avoid conflict for as long as you can, but at the end of the day, not to be afraid to use force when needed.
Mm-hmm. Israel also fights for its name in the world. I mean, delegitimization and all that, that's an ongoing theme. How do you think the fact that Israel is really one of the largest exporters of arms affect that? Public opinion in the world? Does it really an issue that Israel needs to account for?
Look, it's an issue that Israel does need to account for, and there have been stories historically of how Israel has gotten into bed with some of the not best of, bedmates, let's call it, countries and dictatorships and different regimes that were not the most respectable and respectful of human rights and freedoms and liberties of their own people. So I think we do have to be careful there. And in recent years, you've seen an increase in supervision and oversight within the defense ministry of companies and what they can sell and the permits that they need and are required to get before selling technology and military weapons to any of these different types of people. On the other hand, we have to understand where this came from, right? Israel is a story that has always marveled the world, right? It's an ancient people returned to their historic homeland and really achieved the impossible. Still today, it amazes me when I hear some foreign leader who says, I believe in Israel's right to exist. Like, we don't need you to believe in we're here. Why would you say that? But people still say that because it's as if it's still not taken for granted that Israel is here and is going to exist. And, so where this technology came from, it came from a need and necessity. What you then do with it is a separate question. And that was not really addressed in the book, right? And we sustained some criticism for that. I'm happy to address that too. Because the book tells a good tale. The book tells a story of Israeli innovation, Israeli invention, and Israeli brilliance, right? And survival. And I think that's the story, that's where we put the focus on. Someone else could write a different book, maybe we would one day, about, what's the outcome of that and who are some of the relationships that have been cultivated as a result of that. That's a separate story, and that's a story that wouldn't be as positive. But I think we need to separate.
Why didn't you address it? I mean, was it just a conscious decision? Or
No, it was a conscious decision, and people might say that we weren't balanced. I'm perfectly open to criticism. The New York Times, in its review of our book, called us cheerleaders for Israel, and I tend to wear that as a badge of pride or honor when the New York Times calls me a cheerleader of my country. But in all seriousness, the focus of the story is about the innovation, is the unique culture that you'll find here in Israel. And I think it's a culture that you'll get great takeaways about Israel itself, about the society, about the role the military plays, about how we innovate in this country. But if you're even not interested in weapons, but you're interested in business management or business development or high tech, developing some new IT software, this is a book that can also give you insight into how to be creative, how to innovate, how to think out of the box. So it's actually, there are lessons, I think, that you could take away that can be applied to many different fields, not just
So it's essentially a book about the startup nation, and the fact that it deals with the military comes from your background as a military correspondent, as well as your co-author, Amir Bohbot.
Right. I mean, we both were military correspondents for many years. Amir still is a military correspondent. And what we saw over the years covering conflict and the military, Gaza operations, Second Lebanon War, Second Intifada, all of these different things was we saw the soldiers in combat. We saw their weapons being used. But when we took a step back and we said, where does this all come from? That got us thinking there's a bigger story to be told here. And that's where the book was born.
I want to ask you one last question, because we are running out of time, about censorship. How much of what you say in the book, or wanted to say in the book, you couldn't say in the book?
I recently discovered that when the censor takes something out, you're not allowed to say what they took out. But with that said, I can tell you is that the book underwent censorship. We are Israelis. We live in this country, and we are subject to the military censor. I wrote a column last week that called to disband the military censor. I think it is undemocratic and is an entity that should not exist in 2017 in a digital age when information is disseminated around the world in seconds and people can read about Israel's greatest secrets online, like Israel's purported nuclear program, etc. With that said, we abide by the law. We sent the book to the censor, and there were certain things that were sensitive for them, changes, and there were certain modifications. I can't tell you that they took out sections. There was no section that they took out. but there were certain wordings and there were terms and there were references that were sensitive.
No, but do you think that the story is partial because of the of censorship, or was it just a cosmetic?
I'd say 90% of the changes that they made were cosmetic changes. Please change this word for that word, reference this when citing that. Those were 90% of the changes. The other 10% was, a few lines here, a few lines there that really were some secretive things that they didn't want to come out. But the other stuff were details that I thought added to the story, but the fact that they're not there don't necessarily take away from the story. I can give you, if we have time, I'll give you one quick example. We tell the story of how Israel, the first trip that Israeli defense officials made to China back in the 1970s, which opened up the door for China becoming then one of Israel's biggest customers of arms. And we call them in the book that they were known as foreigners, right? That's what they were referred to. Really, they were referred to as the nationality of the passports that they were all carrying, right? But that was something that Israel still does not want to be published, is what exactly was the nationality of which country they were flying under, for the obvious sensitivity. And we have to respect that.
Okay, but it doesn't really detract from the story.
That's my point. In other words, it would have been given it more color to know, which country, whose passports were these guys flying on. But the fact that we don't have that one word in there, I don't think detracts from the story itself. So there were examples like that, but largely the story, it stays the same.
Do you have any plans to publish the book in Hebrew? I mean,
the book is currently in editing in Hebrew and should be coming out hopefully in September.
Right, but everything that you said about Israeli innovation and the military culture and as a source of informality, is this something that would be novel to your Israeli readers, or have you made...
We'll find out.
Have you made significant adaptations for the Israeli
readers?
There were
significant adaptations. We made some adaptations. There's some basic terms and references, kind of a baseline that Israelis start with that's different than what an international audience starts with. So, we took out some of that basic knowledge that Israelis would have. With that said, these stories are stories that have never been told before. And that's what we found to be most interesting is, no one had ever written where the first drone came from. No one ever really told the story behind Israel's satellites. No one ever really told the full Iron Dome story. And I think that those are stories that even for an Israeli audience would be of interest.
All right, Yaakov Katz, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and the co-author of the new book, The Weapons Wizards, How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our website, like us on Facebook, and follow me as well as Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.